Hi, everybody, and welcome to the new format for the videos in this course. Unfortunately, my PhD is sucking out my soul, and I'm a little bit more strapped for time, so I can't exactly make the wonderfully edited, meme-filled videos that I usually make.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
But today we're going to be talking about narratives in video games. And I know that this is a really exciting topic for quite a few of you because I've heard that these are the kinds of games that a lot of you want to make. So let's get right into it. Now, the first question is, why should games tell stories at all? And should they tell stories at all? Now, growing up with games, as many of us did, the obvious answer to this seems like yes, but every few years you get this kind of hot take. This is by a guy named Ian Bogost, who we'll probably talk about later in the course, but he's a game studies scholar and theorist who really likes to have controversial opinions about games, and one of his controversial opinions is that games shouldn't have stories at all. And the take usually goes something like this, whether it's Bogos doing it or somebody else, and there are other people who say this kind of stuff. Games keep trying to be movies and literature, and they're not as good at it as movies or books. So if you're given a game that's trying to be a movie or a book, and then you're given a movie or a book, why not just watch the movie or read the book? Why play a game that's just trying to imitate it? Now, this is a really frustrating take to deal with, because it assumes that cinema and books were always inherently good at telling stories, which they weren't. They took time to develop the kinds of conventions that we're used to today. And it also assumes that movies and books always had a sense of cultural prestige attached to them. They were considered high culture or high art, which they were not. And some movies still are not. But every game designer is going to have to come up against this question in some way or another, partly because it is, in some ways, a valid question when you're making a piece of art. Why make it in this format and not another? And partly because at this point, because games are not seen as high culture, but are seen as popular culture, we often have to justify ourselves to the world at large, whether that means people who could give us the funding to make games, whether it means our parents or some of our professors who don't understand games. We'll have to answer why we want to make a story as a game, why we want to tell a story in the form of a game and not anything else. Now, this answer is going to be different for everybody. But when I answer it, I like to think about affordances. So affordances are a way of thinking about media that emphasizes the forms of expression, communication, and creation that they make easier, more convenient, or better. So the kinds of stories. So we might ask ourselves, what kinds of stories do games allow us to tell, right? What kinds of stories are best told as a game instead of a movie or a book or whatever else? So here's a quick example of affordances. Let's think about Twitter versus Facebook, right? Twitter affords you quick, easy-to-consume communication with a large group of anonymous people. So you can send out communication publicly that anybody can see, that you can read within a minute. Whereas Facebook affords you easy contact with your friends and family. So it's a lot easier for you, for instance, to share life updates on Facebook than on Twitter. So for social media, depending on what kind of communication you want to have or what kinds of messages you want to give, you might pick Facebook or Twitter, right? So for media that tell stories like movies or games, we might say that movies, for example, afford a sort of time-specific, multi-sensory experience that you can have together with other people. So movies take place within a specific amount of time, like let's say 2 hours. They're an experience that you have that involves visuals and sound, and you can have them in a sort of semi-public space, in a movie theater, whenever we'll get to see those again, or in a living room, with your friends and family or whatever. You are all reasonably sure that you're experiencing the same thing at the same time. These are affordances that movies offer that other media don't. So, what do games afford? And to answer that in terms of narrative, I want to look a little bit closer at the types of structures of interactive narrative that games can have. So your reading described nine different structures. They're useful both to think about the kinds of stories that you want to tell with your games and to think about affordances, what kinds of stories are best told for a game. So not all of these structures are necessarily unique to games. So as we go through them, you might ask yourselves which ones you've seen in other media, which ones you've seen as movies or books or whatever. And then you might also ask yourself, which structures are games uniquely good at? Which structure would you rather see in a game form than in a book, for example? So first we have linear narrative, which kind of the simplest form of narrative we can think of, right? You go from point A to point B to point C. Sorry, that was my partner. You go from point A to point B to point C, and you don't have a lot of choice in what order you experience the narrative in, and no matter what choices you make, the narrative is always basically the same. There might be some exploration. For instance, maybe you'll arrive at a city in a game, and then you can explore around the city, or even explore areas that you've previously seen, but however much or however little you explore, it doesn't really affect the narrative at the end of the day. So, I forgot to mention, I'm going to be mentioning a lot of examples, and I'm really sorry to people who don't have as much experience with video games. I recommend you maybe write down some of these titles and check out the trailers for them if you don't really know what I'm talking about here. But a couple of examples of linear narrative games are Pokemon Sword, in which, no matter really which Pokemon you choose, it doesn't really affect the narrative. And the events happen essentially one after the other when you hit specific points in the game. But you can explore freely as well. And then The Last of Us is a very clear narrative game. You sort of walk from place to place and experience different narrative events. So the next step up in terms of complexity is multilinear narrative, which is also often called branching path narrative. So in branching path narrative games, you have specific choice points that you can make, and you make choices and they lead to different specific outcomes or changes in the narrative. The sort of classic example of this is like a dating sim, where you choose who to date via your dialogue choices. Maybe you choose to talk to one love interest over another, and depending on who you speak to and who you date, you experience a different path in the story. But there's always a limited number of pathways, and the problem for us as game designers is that each time we add a pathway, we add that much more content that we have to write. So there's a lot of content involved in creating multilinear narratives. Sometimes, depending on how many pathways you make, you can make, essentially, instead of making like one story, you make 5 stories or 6 stories. So another really good example of this is Fire Emblem 3 Houses. Depending on which house you choose to support at the beginning of the game, you experience a different narrative involving different characters, and you get to know different people. Mass Effect, if anybody's played that, is another good example, where you make different choices that determine the fate of the galaxy. You're sort of a soldier character who becomes the leader of a big army of people. So then we have frame narratives, and this isn't mutually exclusive with the other kinds of narratives. You can have a frame narrative and a linear narrative, but essentially with a frame narrative, it's when you, before you play the game, interact with or experience a non-interactive narrative, so something like a movie or a comic or a website that provides context and background info that helps you understand the game better and experience it better. It might not necessarily be required to understand the story of the game, but it's something where you don't get the full story only by playing the game. So one example of this is Marvel's Avengers, where, of course, the game assumes that you've watched the other Avengers films before you play it. Or God of War, where it's assumed that you have the background context of knowing about the Greek gods in order to fully understand what's going on in the game. Embedded narratives also can be linear or multilinear or anything else. But in an embedded narrative, a story has already happened in the past by the time you as the player arrive on the scene, and you get to explore and essentially put together the narrative that has already occurred by looking for clues and bits and pieces and sort of putting them back together. Usually this takes the form of a detective story or a mystery story, and in a sense, detective novels or movies, like if anybody saw Knives Out, are also embedded narratives, only they're not interactive. So the Phoenix Wright series is a really great example of this. You actually use clues to put together the story. Bioshock is another great example where you pick up these sort of like radio clues where you listen to somebody talking about their life and you piece together what happened to the world of Rapture. Both of these games are linear in terms of the way the player moves through them, but in addition to the sort of linear elements of the narrative, they're also encountering this narrative that they have to put back together. And that doesn't necessarily happen in a linear way. So you don't necessarily encounter the first event in the sequence of the narrative that you're putting together first. You might, for example, discover the body first. So the first fact you learn is that somebody's died, which is actually the end of the story, and you have to piece back together what's happened backwards in time from there. So now we're getting a little bit less linear with modular narrative. With modular narratives, essentially they're standalone stories that you can experience in any order. You don't always need to play all the modules to get to the end, but playing more of them will give you more of an experience of the world. Modular narratives also can have linear components. For example, the beginning and the end could be fixed, but the sort of middle part or the side stories, the side quests, are all things that you can experience in any order. So Mass Effect 2 is a really good example of this. In Mass Effect 2, you have to recruit a bunch of different squad mates who come with you on missions and join you and help you out. But you can recruit these squad mates in any order, and it doesn't really matter what order you encounter them. And each recruitment mission is its own enclosed story. If anybody's played Super Mario Sunshine, or a lot of Super Mario games, beyond the sort of original games, which were linear, but Super Mario games tend to involve going into a world where you can complete the sort of story in the world by getting all of the stars from that world. But you can encounter the different worlds in any order. It doesn't really matter to your experience of the game. So explorable narrative is very similar to modular, except that there's more of an emphasis on exploration between story points. With modular narrative, they tend to be sort of enclosed stories that in themselves are kind of linear, but then you can move between those in different orders. Whereas with explorable narrative, there's more of an emphasis on sort of the journey that takes you from different points to each other. So this is almost all open world games, you know. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is definitely an explorable narrative. Any Assassin's Creed game really is explorable in that the emphasis is on the sort of exploration of the world. And these games always have a fixed beginning and end, as opposed to modular games, which can actually just be entirely modular with no beginning or end. So now we're getting really away from the sort of scripted content, linear narrative like we talked about before. Emergent narratives are not written by authors, but instead are made up of building blocks, which are actually game mechanics and systems. And the narrative that comes out is not from the game, but from the player who puts together the building blocks to create an interesting story. So usually these are the kinds of games where you have really weird experiences, and then you get to talk about them with your friends. You know, different systems come together and create these sort of wacky scenarios. Sometimes people call this war stories. So XCOM's a great example of this, if anybody's played XCOM. You tend to get attached to the characters in that game who are randomly generated, and when they die or sort of heroically sacrifice themselves to save their comrades, there's a sort of story that you create as a player through your experience of playing the game. Civilization is another example of this. Dungeons and Dragons can be an example of this, depending on how the game master organizes the game. But what's specific to Emergent Narrative is that there are specific goals that players have that they're trying to achieve. And so the stories usually come in the process of trying to achieve that goal. Environmental narratives, in contrast, don't involve specific goals on the part of the player. Instead, environmental narratives involve settings, characters, and objects that are all sort of put there by the developers with the hopes that players will take these things and develop them into a story. So there's a really famous, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, or MMORPG, called EVE Online. And it's been going for like over 10 years at this point, and there's a huge social community based around it. And essentially, people at this point have developed these massive guilds that raise like literally hundreds of thousands of real-life dollars to support their activities. I read about one story in EVE Online, when this isn't a fiction story, this is something that really happened, where one very powerful guild put years of their time to create a space station in a wormhole, which is like the most heavily guarded, hardest place to find in like the entire game. And another guild spent a full year coming up with a heist plan, and they actually successfully carried it out and stole like tens of thousands of dollars worth of materials from this like secret wormhole space station. Really intense, really wild story, completely came out of the objects that the developers provided for people. And this wasn't a goal that the developers gave, it was just an incentive that was created naturally by the kinds of objects and forms of interaction that the developers allowed, right? A lot of tabletop role-playing games are also this, where instead of having specific goals, players create stories by interacting with the places that they encounter. And finally, generative narrative. This is entirely theoretical. There's no game that exists that's a true generative narrative yet. The idea of a generative narrative is that as you play the game, the story is generated on the spot in response to your actions. So there's no limitations based on, very specific coding. There's actually infinite possibilities. When you interact with another character, they'll interact with you as a person might interact with you. Some tabletop RPG play experiences approach the experience of generative narrative, which is why I put Dungeon World here, because when you're improvising and involved really deeply in a tabletop RPG, it can become, in a sense, generative. But this doesn't even always happen because it requires a game master who's really, really skilled at improvisation and at creating new things and reacting to player choices. Someday this might exist, but it requires a lot more processing power than we have today. So let's get back to this question. What stories do games allow you to tell? What stories do games afford? And based on what we've talked about and the different structures of narrative that we've considered, here's my answer. Yours might be different. Games afford repetition. So, unlike in a movie or a book, where you read it once and you'll read it again and have the same narrative experience, different playthroughs of games can result in different stories and different experiences, completely different narratives. Games afford choice. Players can make choices that will change the narrative and give them a completely different experience. Games afford exploration. Players can move freely through the narrative and they don't have to move according to specific time. So for example, you can take your time experiencing a game, or you can skip entire sections of it. It's all up to you. Not just in terms of specific choice points, but in terms of the way you actually move through a narrative moment to moment. Games afford improvisation. So especially tabletop games allow players to create new narrative elements and to really feel like they're making a contribution to the outcome of the narrative. Even digital games, while they might not afford actual improvisation, they allow you to imagine narrative possibilities outside of the parameters of the game in ways that other media also allow, but it feels a little bit different. And games afford sociality, so players can create game narratives together, whether that means by competing with each other like in EVE Online, whether it means playing a tabletop RPG and improvising with each other. Players can collaborate on experiences and narratives in a way that you really can't do with movies or books. So, in answer to Ian Bogost, and also to everybody else who has those hot takes about how games would be better off not telling stories at all, of course games should tell stories. I think all of us who have played a game that has told a good story, we can all attest to the unique power of games to tell stories. But as game designers, we should think about the stories that can only be told by games, or the stories that games are uniquely good at telling. This is the kind of stuff that excites me the most. And I hope that moving into the narrative assignment that we're going to talk a little bit about next week, that you'll start to think about what kind of stories you can specifically set out to tell through your game design. And not just try to make a game that tells the story that you want to tell. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. Stay safe.